and the Regilene Center for the Arts. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first in a three-part series of community conversations here on WRFA LP. I'm Jason Sample, WRFA General Manager, and tonight's program is intended to inform, educate, and also inspire thought in the weeks ahead and in years ahead as we focus on various individuals who live in our community. Of course, we have moderators who will be handling this conversation, and we'll get to them in a moment. But I want to let you all know that tonight's program is made possible, as we noted at the start, from Humanities New York, also made possible with the help of a grant from the Community Corporation for Public Broadcasting, as well as the 11th Press Company and our friends here at the Regilene Center for the Arts. Tonight is the first in an unprecedented 5 consecutive Thursday nights of live broadcasting on WRFA. For 3 weeks, we're going to present our community conversation starting tonight, and we'll get to that in a moment. On October 14th, we'll have a live debate featuring the candidates for Chautauqua County Executive and Chautauqua County Clerk. And October 21st, we'll have a Meet the Candidates Forum featuring the Jamestown City Council's contested candidates who are running for office this year. Also, we have a series of live musical performances with Arts on Fire Live, starting Saturday, October 2nd at 8 p.m. with Ken Hardley and Mandy Andrews. Other live performances later in the fall include Cindy Haight, Feverhawk, Cold Lazarus, and The Probables. Funding made possible by the United Arts Appeal. To learn more about those, you can visit our website at WRFALP.com. Getting to tonight's program, our program is intended to raise public awareness of specific groups in Jamestown and the challenges they face, both past and present. It will also work to identify solutions to overcome those challenges in order to bring more inclusiveness, diversity, equity, and accessibility to the community. Each panel discussion will feature representatives from 5 community groups, including the local African American community, the Hispanic community, the LGBTQ community, those affected by chemical dependency, and those impacted by generational poverty. A quick reminder that if you're listening to this at home, streaming online through video, we do have the chat forum open on both YouTube and Facebook. So if you have any questions, feel free to pose them, and we'll get to them near the conclusion of our program in the final half an hour. Now, in addition to being broadcast on WRFA, again, our program is being streamed live thanks to the help of Kip Reynolds at Cranky Plate Productions, and our audio engineer is Regilene Technical Director Owen Murphy. Moving right along here, we will introduce our panelists in a moment, but first I want to thank our project team. This wasn't done in a vacuum. We had several individuals help us put this panel conversation together. Amanda Gessing from the YWCA of Jamestown, Amy Roller from the United Way of Southern Chautauqua County and her staff, Ashley Sensky from the Jamestown City Historian, Greg Rabb from SUNY JCC, Julia Cecila Hanley, WRFA Public Affairs Director, Justin Hubbard from the Jamestown Justice Coalition and the Jamestown Human Rights Commission, Kevin Whitaker, the Jamestown Public Schools Superintendent, Max Martin from the Hispanic Community Council, Noah Goodling from the Fenton History Center, and Tamu Graham Reinhardt, Jamestown City Council. Also, thanks to the Regilene and WRFA staff and the Regilene Board of Directors and the WRFA Community Advisory Board. So let's begin our program. Julia Cecila Hanley is one of the co-moderators. She has been the Public Affairs Director at WRFA since April of 2021. More recently employed as the City of Jamestown's Recreation Coordinator for 12 years. And Ms. Cecila Hanley previously served on WRFA's Community Advisory Board and as a volunteer since the station's inception 17 years ago. Also, we have Amit Taneja, who serves as the inaugural Senior Vice President and Chief IDEA Officer, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility at Chautauqua Institution. He started in this role in May 2021. He has over 2 decades of experience doing IDEA work in higher education, and most recently served as Associate Provost at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. He has also worked at Hamilton College, Syracuse University, Bowling Green State University, and the University of British Columbia. We are very happy to have him on board, as well as Julia, and with that being said, I'll hand it over to both Julia and Amit. Thank you for watching and attending in the audience.
Thank you very much, Jason, and a warm welcome to the audience members present here in the studio today, and those of you who are joining us online. As mentioned earlier, I'm Amit Taneja. I thought we'd start a little bit by acknowledging that we have the 5 communities that Jason mentioned here, present here today, but there are also many other communities that are part of the Jamestown community area that we're not able to have here today, but that there might be more conversations that we have in the future, or as the panelists are talking today, that we be mindful that this is not a full representation of folks who may be marginalized in the Jamestown area. We also want to take a moment to explain that this is week 1 of the 3-week series that is happening here. So we have really thought of this as a progression. In week 1, today, we will be really discussing the history and the legacy and the moments of pride that many of these communities may experience, have experienced historically in Jamestown. Next week, we will focus more on the present state of circumstances. What are the current day challenges? We will spend a little bit of time really thinking about how COVID has helped illuminate some of the challenges, or helped maybe even illuminate some of the strengths that might exist in these communities. And then we will conclude in week 3 looking forward towards the future of the ways in which communities can work together inside and outside with one another to work towards the goals that they have. So it's the past, present, and future sort of format. So that is what we will be doing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to introduce our panelists.
Right, and we will be going from my right to left, and we'll start with Justin Hubbard. Justin is part of the Jamestown Justice Coalition, as well as he is also on the Jamestown Human Rights Commission. He is here representing the African American Committee. We have Greg Rabb to his left, and Greg Rabb is a professor at Jamestown Community College. He is a former Jamestown City Council president. He currently chairs the Jamestown Board of Public Utilities, and he's here as a representative of the LGBTQ community. On the other side of Amit is Max Martin, who is on the Chautauqua County Hispanic Community Council, and he's here representing the Hispanic community. And at the end, we have Steve Cobb, who is the executive director of the Chautauqua County Mental Health Association, and he's here representing those dealing with chemical dependency. We're supposed to have a 5th member here today covering generational poverty, but unfortunately, they had something urgent that prevented them from being here. We will be covering this area at our next week's conversations. So moving forward, we shared some of our questions that we're going to be asking tonight ahead of time with our panelists, because unlike a debate situation, we thought it would be great that they had some information to be prepared to ask, because we are going to be asking about history and want them to have time to reflect on what they want to talk about ahead of time. We are asking our panelists to keep their answers a little brief, about 3 to 4 minutes, just so we have a chance to talk about all topics at hand. And so we will be gathering audience questions at a certain point. So, if you do have those, once again, you can either submit those online if you're watching online, or you can submit them if you're here in audience to one of our staff members here. So I think we are ready to start with questions.
Yeah, so our focus this week, as we said, was the history, so that's a good place to start. So we're going to invite our panelists to share a little bit of information about the history of the presence of their communities in the Jamestown area, but we're also asking them to situate their answers within a larger context of a history, right? So if we're talking about African American history in Jamestown, if it's possible to also situate it with whatever was happening nationally, with federal policies, with state laws that helped establish or hinder the establishment of those communities here. So with that, we're going to start left to right, or right to left, I guess. So we'll start with Justin. So talk a little bit about sort of the history of the African American community in the Jamestown area and how it may have been situated in a larger context.
Yeah. First, thanks for having me. And I want to start by saying my family, I'm biracial, and my father is actually from New York City. So a lot of the history that I've learned about Jamestown as far as the Black community, I learned in college. I learned just with my own research. Whereas I'd say the majority of the Black community in Jamestown, this is passed down by generation. A lot of oral history there. So I just might have like a different perspective for some things. But I'd say the story of Black people in Jamestown it's not unlike most communities in the United States. It's a story of adversity and perseverance, sometimes in the face of struggle. Black people have been here since actually before the city was called Jamestown, when it was just known as like the Rapids. Um, and there was a fur trader that was actually here, and he went between Cattaraugus County and Chautauqua County, and he was really the first black resident that was in the history of Jamestown. After that, the Prendergasts actually owned enslaved African Americans, and then I'd say the most prominent member of the black community in our history was Catherine Harris, who was a well-known name in Jamestown because of her work on the Underground Railroad. And that was in response to the Fugitive Slave Act that happened in America, where if you were an enslaved person that ran to the north in the past, you were free. But after the Fugitive Slave Act, if you got caught, they would ship you back down to the south, and the people that were helping the runaway enslaved people would also be charged with crimes. So Catherine Harris not only worked a station for the Underground Railroad and sheltered, I think the number is unofficially about 20 enslaved runaway slaves, but she also found the AME Zion Church, and really that's where the organization for the black community is in Jamestown. It's with the big three churches. It's with the Zion Church, Emmanuel Baptist Church, and then the Church of God on North Main. After that, when we get into the 50s and 60s, it's really about integration. It's about trying to go beyond just a almost minor, lower level, impoverished existence in Jamestown. The community, the black community in Jamestown, has always lived in a specific area. The numbered streets, about 8th through 12th Street. It used to be known as the Black Strip, is what a lot of white people would call it. And now people that live down there call it the Valley. It's been known as the Valley for a couple decades now. And it's it's down the hill from Lakeview Avenue, Lakeview Avenue is a really prominent street back in the day. So it's, the black community has like we said, a history of really persevering through struggle. And all of the major events, Fugitive Slave Act, Underground Railroad, Civil Rights Act, integration, and then even the Black Lives Matter movement now, Jamestown was a part of all of those movements.
Thank you. That's wonderful. It's a great broad overview to get. We're going to try and do this with the rest of the communities present here today, so we'll invite Greg next to share some comments about the LGBTQ community.
Thank you. First, I just want to thank WRFA for doing this. If I think in terms of my own history, when I got here in 1986, and I was terrified to be out as a gay man, and here we are in 2021 on a panel talking about it. So we've made progress, but as a good friend of mine, Marvin, says, just because things are better doesn't mean things are good enough, especially for a lot of young people and trans people. But part of the problem, and I have to apologize for my voice, I'm still getting over a bad allergy attack last week. When Justin was talking about African Americans always being here, LGBTQ people were always here too. But we were terrified to be open about who we are. I still remember coming here in 1986 as a relatively young man with dark brown hair and was terrified to say anything about me being gay, because at that point there was absolutely no legal protection of any kind here in the state. There was a weak policy at SUNY, excuse me, but that was about it. So one of the ways people controlled LGBTQI or queer people, I have no problem with that term, so hopefully no one's offended, was to make us scared to come out. And so it was impossible to connect with one another. And so our history is very difficult to discover. It's there, and I have to congratulate the Fenton for doing a pride and protest project, including where a lot of my stuff is now archived, because at least Fenton was trying to help us to discover what the history is. But most of us are very quiet and hidden, and it was a very effective way to oppress us, because we didn't need anybody to oppress us. We oppressed ourselves. And so when I got here, I had heard informal things about a bar and some folks, but there was absolutely no way for me to get connected with other folks like myself in the community. And so I kept a lot of my ties in Buffalo and other places in the country. And of course, this is all pre-internet and pre-email. It was pretty tough. And I felt very isolated. But at one point, after I got tenure, I decided to come out. And, you know, my own history when I came out, it was rough. Death threats. The Buffalo media saw me sort of as a, I don't know, a token of interest. They were covering me. And all I did was come out. And I didn't think it'd be that big of a deal. But other gay people actually were mad at me for coming out. I had people tell me if I would just shut up and go back into the closet, everything would be all right. And I thought, wow, talk about effective oppression. Tell the guy who's out trying to change things to shut up and go away. And so we have a very complicated history, and we actually don't know it. Now, I'm getting pretty old. I'm knocking on the door of 70. And I know just from teaching at the college, I now have more kids, if I can call them that, coming out as gay and trans and pansexual and bisexual and asexual. And I'm really excited because all these kids, you know, we had a club fair and more kids signed up for the prospective gay pride club, if you want to call it that, than any other club this year. And so I thought, wow, I'm suddenly in this world of LGBTQIA plus people, and we were always here. But the problem is then we lost our history, and trying to recover it is extremely difficult. Early on, I was asked to teach gay courses up at Buff State, which I did, and only recently have I started to teach a class at JCC called Beyond the Binary. And I get students who, some are queer, some are just allies, interested, they want to know more, and we tend to be a voice of activism on campus. And fortunately, you know, this past year we had a pride celebration in Jamestown. And so, again, things are better, but one of the things that's missing, and I think that we might have something in common with the African American community, because we're always trying to look at because obviously they're black queer people too. Yes. But we lost our history. And so one of the tasks, I think, for a lot of our communities is to try to rediscover it, because we got enormous gaps locally, nationally, internationally. But having a program like this is really helpful, so thank you.
Thank you. I'm already feeling very good that we're having this conversation, because we're already seeing a little bit of a thread here in that Justin mentioned that a lot of the history is orally preserved, right? And you talked about the difficulty of documenting that history. This forum, this conversation by itself is going to serve at least as some form of an archive, right, so that we're preserving this history for generations to come. So thank you to you both for being here. We're going to keep the conversation moving. So I'm going to invite my colleague Max Martin to talk a little bit about the history of the Hispanic, Latinx, Latina community in Jamestown.
I moved here about 12 years ago, and I was surprised to see so many Latinos here. My wife said this huge amount of Latino, but back then about 10% of the community. So I did find out some of the history, and everything is oral. Nothing is written. There's nothing, no newspaper, pretty much nothing about the Hispanic being here. The ladies that I know, they came in the early 50s because there were jobs for them to do, especially in the factories. And one thing about Latino in general, when they see something good, they bring their families. And with that is, for the past 10 years, it went from about 10% Hispanic to about 20+% Hispanic, because they keep bringing. And those are the people that also we are very mobile, because we have connection all over the state. So they might leave Jamestown, and 3 months later they come back here. Because this, believe it or not, this is a good place for the Latino family to live in. Great education, great school, great medicals. The lacking is the jobs. When they moved here early, there was a lot of jobs for them. Now it's very little. One of the things, the Latino family in general, and let me put in perspective, we are not a community. We are population or Hispanic, which is not the same as having a community center. And my job for the past 12 years is trying to create that atmosphere or united, be part of our community. It's working, it's not there yet, it's many, many years to go, but because of the history is lost, so the next generation don't know anything. The only thing they know is the present, and that's sad. What happened yesterday, not what happened 50, 60, 70 years ago. That is a lacking that we need to engage the community to say what happened 60 years ago, what happened 70 years ago, why did they move here? The only thing people know about Latinos is that we're here to collect welfare because there's no job. It's kind of sad. There are organizations out there that have done a lot of things to move the Latino community to the next level of education, and I don't want to plug, I'm not going to say the college, but one college took that need that it was more, there was a necessity for educated Latino in the job force. And they did something, and they created that opening for Latino to go back to school. And it's working, it's been about 6, 7 years in that program, and it's multiplying and multiplying. So there's a need for professional Latinos, but majority of the people in general think that we are here to collect. And to be honest, it's really good to be here. Like I said, going back, you come here from anywhere, Puerto Rico, whatever other part of the United States, and you get the help almost immediately. And one of the examples, if you go to New York City, it will take you 6 to 7 months to get anything. And here it will take you maybe a week. So they're coming, and they're not going to stop. It's not the weather, it's the benefit that they get here. It's a great place to live. The crime is very little. So they come from city that is crime affected. They come here is, wow, it's a wow moment. What we want as Latino is now to be treated special, to be treated equally. And that's what is missing here. We not be treated equally because they assume it's the same principle the African American. There's a separation, there's a wall between the non-Hispanic and the Hispanic. I don't see it, I don't know why. Maybe because my name is Max Martin and I don't look typically Hispanic. And I've been to places that they don't know I'm Hispanic and they talk negative about the Latino community. Soon they find out I'm Hispanic, they go, well, I don't, they're trying to make excuses. But in general, we have a lot of good people in Jamestown that have been here for years. I mean, you're talking about the early 70s, early 50s. That's almost 80 years ago. So we're not new, but people see the new influx. One of the biggest influxes was after Maria. We had a really good influx of Puerto Rican because they have family here with roots, and they know they can help each other. But in general, there's this very rich. I would like to see the historical society is to actually go in depth because we've been here for many, many years. Not like the African American, but it's a good history. So hopefully this would be a catalyst to start the conversation to find out who we are. Because we are productive. Not everybody is collecting welfare like people assume or selling drugs. We need to eliminate that from their vocabulary. We're here to be part of our community. So hopefully with all of us, we can create a community, not a population of Hispanic.
Thank you very much for that. And that's actually a really good point to remind not only myself and the rest of the panelists, but also our audience members, when we're kind of using labels to describe communities as if it is one monolithic, one experience, but that's not how it operates. In every single one of these broader categories that we're talking about, there are several different histories, different timelines, different experiences. So thank you for that. It's a very important reminder. And last but not least, we're going to go to Steve to talk a little bit about chemical dependency and the history of folks who have been dealing with that in the Jamestown area.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this discussion. It was interesting when I realized I was part of a discussion on talking about community, and I don't know that people who experience substance use disorder think of themselves as a community in quite that same way. And I was trying to figure that out. And as I was thinking about it, thinking how people who experience substance use disorder are in all of these communities. And while those of us who have experienced or do experience a substance use disorder, while we identify with that community, I think for many of us, our goal is to leave that label behind and not be identified just as being part of that community, but then part of the larger community. And there's a saying that I've really embraced that the opposite of addiction is connection and community, because addiction is a disease that separates you. And in those of us who work and support people with substance use disorders, one of our big goals is to connect people with, a lot of times at first, the recovery community, and then the larger community to support them. But one of the, and I have experienced the same thing as a lot of the folks up here has in trying to get the history of our community, and it doesn't exist. It's all been oral. I am gonna tip my hat a bit to AA in Jamestown. AA in Jamestown has an archive, and they have a very thorough history of Alcoholics Anonymous in Jamestown. And addiction, I think, has been part of communities since human beings decided to spend time together. I think we've always looked for ways to get outside of ourselves, to relieve stress. It's part of our DNA. As I look back to see where that history actually was in Jamestown, in 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous started in this country, and in 1945, Alcoholics Anonymous started in Jamestown. So it was only 10 years later that Alcoholics Anonymous had established itself in Jamestown. And, you know, prior to actually very recently, an organized treatment community to support people did not exist. The thing that we most often had in the hospitals were what were called drunk tanks, where people who were drunk were taken. They were supported as they sobered up. And then, as somebody told me, they were given things. So they were given clothes, they were given food. Sometimes they were given money with the idea that if you gave these things back to the person, it would lift their self-esteem, they would feel better about themselves, and then they would not return to drinking. In 1974, in Jamestown, the Jamestown Area Council on Alcoholism was formed, and they were located on Prather Avenue, and they are now in our community known as Prevention Works. And their first goal, and they were formed in response to a community outcry, and realizing that there was no support for people who were experiencing primarily alcoholism. At that point, the places you would go to get support if you were struggling with alcoholism would not support you and didn't want to support you if you were experiencing an addiction to drugs. It was viewed as two separate things. At that point, alcohol was legal, drugs were not legal, and that criminal justice element played a big part in that. So in 1974, the Jamestown Area Council on Alcoholism was formed, and they provided a place where people could come, they could dry out, and it was also a place where people could come and meet with counselors who would leave their clinics and come there to meet with people. There'd be supports for their family, and it was a very short-term thing, and there was no such thing as a rehab as we know it at that point in Chautauqua County, and there wasn't even in Western New York at that time, believe it or not. It was, and just getting back to that in historical context, that idea of what we think of as a rehab, that started in the 1950s in Minnesota, and it's called the Minnesota model. And it started at a clinic that has evolved into what we now know as Hazelden, which is one of the most well-known and respected treatment centers in the country. And honestly, what they did at that point was they took the model of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and put it in a inpatient setting. So a lot of those, almost all of those early rehabs that supported people with alcoholism or chemical dependency, if you could get in, and if you did get in, you had to prove first that your primary addiction was to alcohol. And if you could not get in, if you could not prove that your primary addiction was to alcohol, they wouldn't admit you. In 1989, and I was surprised to learn how recent that was. That was during my lifetime. WCA Hospital in March of 1989, under the direction of a big part of the Chemical Dependency recovery community here in Jamestown, Andy O'Brien, started training folks at WCA Hospital in a program of support, and they took their first patient on May 15th, 1989, at WCA Hospital, and that was the first inpatient treatment center for alcoholism in Jamestown. Also found it interesting that Narcotics Anonymous did not come to Jamestown until 1990, in recent history, and I think that speaks enormously to the problems that the recovery community has had with law enforcement, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, that the two don't work together, and we so assume that they work together. And then the organization that I represent, the Mental Health Association, we were formed in 1979. And in 2006, we shifted our model to become a peer-based organization. So we were focused on advocacy and the power of a person who is in recovery, that ability to help somebody else who is in recovery. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to go with the next question, and I actually want to stay with you, Stephen, because you were referencing how recently it was that some of these programs have come to Jamestown, and my question was, what are some of the struggles your community has faced in the past? And I think it just made logic sense to start with what you were already saying there.
Yeah. So, I think the struggle that we face as a community, besides the substances we use, is stigma. It really is. The stigma that is associated with somebody who uses substances to the point of a chaotic nature is significant, and it still is. There was a recent survey that was done about from employers as to whether you would hire somebody if you knew they were in recovery. And the number of employers who, if they knew that that person had a history of abusing drugs, not alcohol, and that they would be willing to hire if they had that knowledge, was right around 20%. Even if they knew they were in recovery, it was still about 20%. The number was a bit higher if somebody identified, or if you identified the prospective employee as somebody who struggled primarily with alcohol. That was there was a bit more forgiveness in that. That's a huge issue. And what happens with stigma like that, when it comes from the outside, it eventually internalizes to the person who has the disease, and so you're fighting stigma on two levels. I think one of the other things that really impacted and caused struggle for our community was President Nixon declaring a war on drugs on June 18th in 1971. And that really transformed the way the U.S. federal government looked at people who had substance use disorders. It looked at them as criminals. It was a complete commitment on that part. And I think the other thing our community has struggled is actually the lack of scientific evidence as it relates to treating people with substance use disorders. So up until very recently, until early 80s, the primary model for treating people, whether it was with alcohol or a chemical addiction, was the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-Step Recovery is an amazing program that has helped an enormous amount of people. But there's so many other things that we need to look at when treating people. We also have to remember that everyone who suffers from a substance use disorder doesn't connect and fit in with a 12-step model. It's based on finding a spiritual connection that will help heal you. And while for many people, including myself, found refuge and help in that, just the research to really look at what do we need to do from a medical point of view to treat people who are experiencing substance use disorders. And even at that point, even at this point now, it's very hard to do federal research even on something like cannabis to really look at what its real impact is. There's more and more evidence coming to light, but to even look at somebody who does have an addiction to cannabis, and not everybody develops an addiction to cannabis, how do you treat that? What's it doing to the body? We really need to focus more on the scientific part of that, and how do we support people who have substance use disorder. It's changing, and it's going forward, but it's still a stumbling block for us.
Oh, thank you for those comments. Max, we'll come back, and we're going to keep working our way backwards. And Max, if you could answer the same question, and this would be, what are the struggles that the Hispanic community has faced here in the Jamestown area?
Like I said, in the early 50s, there was no struggle because of plenty of job for them to do. One of the things that I see mostly is that they don't recognize what a Puerto Rican means. Puerto Rican's actually American. There's no difference between a Puerto Rican from somebody from Georgia, Alabama, or Florida. The difference between those two is they're not required to speak English. So what I see in general is this misunderstanding of they're immigrants. They're not immigrants. They're American citizens. And because the stigma isn't there, a lot of jobs do not look at them as part of the U.S., which is kind of sad. So that's one of the biggest things that I see in job problems, getting jobs. The second part is they don't feel welcome. You're talking about in the early 50s, they don't still not feel welcome in the city. And I know I've been here 12 years, and I participate in pretty much every conversation there's been, being part of board members or many boards in Jamestown, and there's a stigma that they're not part of our community. And the neat thing is, or the weird part is, they spend so much money to try to integrate the Latino into our community without asking questions. What are your needs? So majority of the non-for-profit trying to provide the services that they need, that they think they need, they don't ask the question. One of the questions you say, Latinx. Latinx in the Latino community is not acceptable because in general, they don't understand what that means. Latino or Latina. Latinx is a combination of whoever you think you are. So in general, if you talk to Latinos in Jamestown, when you hear that word, they say, what's that mean? That's not made up by a Latino. That's made up of somebody else that think the Latino needs that. So the conversation is asking questions, what are your needs? If you want, they're not going to leave Jamestown. This is the fastest growing community in Chautauqua County, the Latino in Jamestown. So they're not going anywhere. They're coming, and they will come. Even though to the struggle, because there's a lot of help that they provide. Again, one of the biggest key that I asked my familia when they move here is, why are you here? Better school, better medical. Two things that make them move over here. Kind of interesting. Why then I move to Florida? Well, it's hard to do that. So they come in here. The second part is they have already roots built in here. So it's easy to come with a cousin, an uncle, or nephew. They move here, they can support. So about 7 years ago, I started the Hispanic Community Council because I saw a lot of money going out there trying to help the Latino, but nobody was getting help. So when I started a non-for-profit, it's self-supported by me. I don't ask for money because there's a need to connect and build bridges. So my goal for the past 7 years is build bridges between the Latino and non-Latinos and getting jobs, resume, working with the college, JCC, JBC, Fredonia, work with Dunkirk, which is another area that brings Latinos into Jamestown. They go back and forth. So it's a big connection between Dunkirk and Jamestown because some of their family are connected. So the biggest part is we want to be, and I feel welcome. Me personally, I have no problem. But my Latinos, they have a lot of problems. They don't feel welcome. I think in general, the school district is doing a fantastic job. They just hired 2 navigators because they know the need to connect the Latino with the school. We want to make the school the center of the family, and it's not now. So hopefully in the next couple of years, that's the goal. So this movement going around, because we're growing. If it was diminishing, they probably never pay attention to us. We are growing. So there is going to be sooner or later that the mayor of Jamestown will be a Hispanic. Or, I think it was a councilman that was Spanish one, Pagan. So there will be a movement later on. If Latino get united in one mindset, is powerful. Because we're not a community, we're not united. So again, the stigma is we are not quote unquote Americans because you don't speak the language. And I've seen it myself, by the way. This is nothing new, I've seen it. And I have to educate them, they're American. Just like Puerto Rican at like Florida, there's no difference. So it's an education part is, I also stop them from saying there's a bunch of racist people here. I don't think the racism is here in general. It's lack of education about culture. If you don't know my culture, the first thing I'm going to do is what? Reject you. So one of the key, and we tried to do it in Jamestown many times, we have different meetings and connection and talk about how can we connect the Latino community, events, and I try to do one event a year to celebrate Hispanic heritage, and I select different places to do that. And believe it or not, half of the people that show up are not Hispanic, which is love it. I love it. So the difference is, if you understand the Latino culture is beautiful, and it's so much between arts, food, and music. We had 20 countries with different type of music, food, and activities. Jamestown has about 7 of them, from Dominican, the majority are Puerto Rican, but you got Dominican, Colombian, Venezuela, Cubans. So them moving here is a great place to live. I told Greg in the conversation earlier, I'm not moving out of here. My family's in Florida, I'm not moving to Florida. I'm staying here. This is a great place to live. But we want to feel welcome. And part of the welcoming, understand the culture. The same thing with LGBT. Understand what that means. What does it mean? What does a Latino mean? What is an African American? A lot of people also has a problem with African American. They don't understand the culture. We're totally different. But if you want to make a community stronger, you can't be divided. And we live in silos in this county. Silos everywhere. They have the fear of letting people in because for some reason they're going to take over, I guess. So that fear, when that fear is eliminated, we're going to have the most beautiful city in the world. But it has to be broken and put back together. Right now, it's too many silos, too many conversations. We're going to help there, we're going to have that. But they don't ask us the question, what do you need? The only thing we need is to look at us equal. That's it. Give an opportunity. We got so many smart people here, Latino people, that can't get jobs because the little language barrier, which is a bit difficult. But if you have a big population of Hispanic, they have a lot of money to spend. Don't you think it would be smart for a corporation to say, hey, let's hire some Latinos to bring those business into it, that money into it? What they do, they go to outside Jamestown to buy stuff, which is kind of sad. So the stigma is we are American like everybody else. Everybody else. And by the way, I'm not Puerto Rican, I'm in Dominican Republic. I came here when I was 13 years old with no language. I learned English in the street, so I know the struggle of languages. So the idea is that we like to work. We like hard work is good for us. We're not lazy people, like people assume in Guiana, that's another thing, we assume lazy. We're not. We like to work. We like to earn money, but we also love family. And we don't feel that we are part of Jamestown family yet. And that's where you see pockets. And then, Pendergast is one, Second Street was another one, the old Latino. But now if you look at the school district map, they're all over the place now. So they are not just centralized in one location, we all over the place. And the only thing we want is understand our culture, which is beautiful, merengue, bachata, rice and beans. My gosh, you don't know what you're missing. So the idea is understand our culture because it's beautiful. Again, even with the Hispanic, Puerto Rican, Dominican, we're a little different. We protect each other. Dominican, Puerto Rican, they keep it. But in general, we are Hispanic. So again, the Latinx, I already brought it out to a couple of pastors that I know, they don't like that word. Because we Latino, Latina, that's who we are. But in the new generation, that's okay.
I was just going to say, so I mostly worked at a college for the last 2 decades, and particularly with Latino, Latina, Latinx populations. That term is actually not just being used in the LGBTQ community, it's actually being used by
the young generation that can get
so
into that.
it's
But
maybe a generational divide more than anything.
But you have
else,
to be
so.
careful of that, because today, when we look at grandma, she's the queen. And grandma said, don't use that word, you're not going to use that word. So we have to be careful how we integrate that. But it's part of the movement of the culture. We're learning from each other. But if you bring it to them, this is the reason we do that, they're open. Don't force us to believe in what you believe. And that's the difference. But let us get you to know each other. Conversation like this is priceless.
Great.
But the neat thing, we need to keep going.
And keeping going and talking about language and how language is important. And coming back to Greg, earlier you had said, you used the word queer, and you said that you didn't have a problem with it, some other people may still. And talking about struggles of the past of the LGBTQ plus community, queer was a word that was used against that community and still is by some people, even though there has been an effort to take it back. But you've talked about some of the struggles that you've seen historically here in Jamestown. I mean, are other things that you can talk about that you have seen yourself or heard of others that have talked in regards to that community?
Well, let me talk about the struggle that anyone who is queer or LGBTQI+, however you want to define it, the first struggle is within yourself. Because growing up when I did in the 50s and the 60s, I knew I was attracted to the boys in my class, but I didn't know what that meant. And I didn't know anybody else that had that feeling, and I didn't know anybody else I could talk to. There certainly were no role models the way there are sometimes today on TV and movies and every place else. So basically, the first thing, if you're queer, you have to figure it out yourself. And even though things have changed, everyone who comes to that realization at some point now at an earlier and earlier age, I kind of feel sorry for some of the kids because, puberty hit me around 11, and there was a classmate of mine, Gary, and I remember being very attracted to him. But I was in a Catholic school, and I always joke when I was going to go up to a sister and say, hey, sister, I'm attracted to Gary. What do I do? I'm sure I would have been slapped or chastised. And I won't go any further down that path. But so the first struggle was in myself. I had to come to terms and say to myself, I am gay. But at that point, we weren't even using that term. So it took me until I was 30 before I moved away from, I grew up in Buffalo. I moved away, I got a better job in Rhode Island, and while I was there, I went to a psychiatrist because I thought I was sick, which I wasn't, but I thought I was because everybody said if you're attracted to the same gender, you're sick. And I told the psychiatrist, I'm gay, and he said, okay, good, what do you want to do about it? And what I remember about that incident was a tremendous weight was lifted off my shoulders, and then I have spent the rest of my life coming out, because that's the other thing. Because I appear to be straight acting and I have a deep voice, I don't look like somebody's stereotype vision of what I mean, I've had gay people tell me I wasn't gay. This is really bizarre. But I won't tell that story because, it's not appropriate.
We're alive.
Yeah, I'm keeping it clear. I'm always going through this, and I remember a student of mine a few years ago, he was with me for a very long time, he was gay, and he said, how come you never talked about being gay in class? I said, well, it didn't have anything to do with the class. So why should I say I'm gay, although my activities on campus, always advocating. So you first have to come to terms with yourself, which I did, and a lot of people don't, and they do end up, abusing chemicals. A lot of my friends who struggle with this end up with drugs, alcohol, because they can't come to terms with this. So I was very fortunate. I came to terms with it. Then I decided, okay, I got to come out partially for my own good and partially maybe because I can help others deal with it. And so, when I teach this stuff in class, one of my favorite authors, Vicki Eklor, she wrote a book that I still use called The Queer History of the United States. And she talks about the history of gay lives, and I'll just say gay for now, but that's all of us, is one of sickness, crime, and sin, the triad. And it wasn't until the 1970s that the American Psychological and Psychiatric Association said being gay wasn't a sickness. I was in my 20s when I finally got a message saying, "You're not sick." And then it wasn't until the 1990s, when I was already in my 40s, that the Supreme Court finally said, it's not a criminal act for me as a man to engage in a sexual act with another man where we're both adults and we freely consent. Up to that point, it was called sodomy, and you could be thrown in jail, and lots of gay men were. It was almost always directed at men because, I am a man, obviously, I identify with a male, at least I think it's obvious, and women were not seen as a threat to the culture. Women, if they're lesbians, well, you know how women are. They're all emotional. But, men, when we don't correspond to the stereotype, we're destroying America. If women do it, let them do it. But when I do it, I'm destroying America. So, we changed that. We got rid of the sickness label, fortunately. But, I have a good friend, a rabbi up in Buffalo, who, when she told her family she was a lesbian, she got shock treatment. This was in the 50s. She's a little older than me, and she talks about it. It's really, as if the shock treatment can cure you because you're sick. And then we finally got rid of that. For the most part. And then we got rid of the crime label. The biggest obstacle is the sin label. When I was out and vocal in the community, I was always getting letters from ministers telling me that I was sinning and that I was leading my students to hell. I had ministers come up to me and say that. One time a minister came up to me and said, "Mr. Rabb," I go, "Yes, why are you leading your students into hell?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're advocating that they should be homosexual." I said, "No, I'm advocating that if they are homosexual, they should be open about it." And he used the term homosexual, which most of us don't use because it's an old term imposed on us. And at one point I just said to him, "Well, I don't believe in hell, so I can't take him anywheres." And he was horrified. But having been raised a nice little Catholic boy, for those of us who are Catholic, I'm sort of hanging on by my fingernails all the time because officially, according to the Catholic Church, despite Pope Francis supposedly being so liberal, he has reiterated that if you have homosexual desires, you're objectively disordered. And I'm going to hell. And that doesn't bother me so much, but it does bother some of my students who are raised in very Christian Catholic households. They're getting this message, and they're scared to death, even if they say, "Well, I don't believe in hell." But they're still scared because their parents will reject them. And so I've tried with some effort very slowly to change some parts of the Catholic Church, like my former high school. And I did that because when they do that, it separates you from your family. I remember when my mother was dying. She lived with me here in Jamestown. And we spent a lot of time together near the end because she knew she was going. I knew she was going. And she said to me, "You got to make 3 promises to me." I said, "Okay, Mom, what do you want?" She said, "First of all, you take care of the nuns because there's an order of nuns up in Buffalo that a friend of mine belonged to, who were very good to my mother." I said, "No problem, Mom. I'll do what I can to help them out." Then she said, "You got to take care of the family." I said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of my brother. I'll take care of his kids. I'll take care of his grandkids." Because she said, with my mom, like a lot of our families, it doesn't matter if you're black, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. Family, like Max is talking, extremely. And I came out of a Polish family where family was everything. And you listen, like you said, you listen to Grandma. I listened to my mom. I was a grown man. And I said, "No problem, Mom. I'll take care of the family." And then the last request was, and she was crying near death, and she said to me, "I want you to be a Catholic again." Because my mother respected my right not to go to church, although at the end of her life, out of respect for her, I always took her to Mass. And it still pains me. This has been a while. My mom's been gone, I forget now how long. That was the one promise I couldn't make to her. I said, "Well, Mom, look, just get well." I mean, I was evasive. And that still hurts me because this is my mom. And I'm thinking, why is the church, whether it's Catholic or other Christian churches, putting children separated from their families? And that's what it did. And I know my mom loved me no matter what. She loved me as a gay kid. When I had a partner, she loved him as a son-in-law. My mother used to go to gay events with me. She was great. She loved my gay friends. She said, "Oh, your friends are so nice," and they were. But all I can remember at the end is I couldn't honor that last request. You know, I'm almost 70, and it still hurts me. I won't start crying, but I could. Because how dare anybody put something between me and my family, especially when I listen to everybody here. You know, one thing we all have in common, I think, with a lot of us, especially if we're some sort of ethnic group, which we all are, family is everything. My brother just died a few months ago. And we were so fortunate that we were all vaccinated, and the hospital let us stay in the ICU with him until he passed with my brother's kids. And, you know, I suddenly became the family patriarch. And I remember the promise to my mother that, and my brother, that I would take care of them as best as I could. But we can't seem to break this religion thing. And it still causes my students pain, it causes me pain, it caused my mother pain. How dare you hurt my mother, who was, you know, I'm not sure I believe in heaven, except my line is, if there's a heaven, my mother better be in there, or none of us are going. So religion is still a big sticking point. Thank you for letting me get so personal.
No, that really.
I give you 3 more minutes to you, so you're good.
Say what?
I gave you 3 additional minutes.
Oh, thank you, Max. I appreciate it.
And thinking about family and how important it is, and thinking about struggles of communities, and thinking of the African American community, and historically what was done to families when they were brought to this country by slave owners. And I think about the lasting effect on families going forward in history, and the struggles that have resulted from that. Justin, if you could talk some more about what we have seen historically with struggles here in Jamestown for the African community.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about Black history, I mean, just almost, I almost avoid talking about enslavement, because to me it is a part of the Black experience in the United States, but it's such a stain on the Black experience, because you're being stripped from your homeland, of your culture, you're being stripped of your history, of your family, of your name. So it's a very difficult subject to talk about, because you know, in a lot of Black history, it really stops at slavery, because we cannot trace it back to Africa, right? It's very difficult to find out where you were from. And in Jamestown, you know, we're not unaffected by that. You know, the founder of the city, James Prendergast, had slaves. And I remember when I found that out, I was in college. I was like, what? It surprised me, but then I was like, actually, that's not that surprising, is it? You know, rich enough to, you know, be the founder of a city, and obviously, you know, a white person probably had enslaved people. And that's really where the struggle starts. It's the same experience as anywhere else in America. You know, struggle starts with enslavement, and then of course you get, you know, the Underground Railroad, which, you know, one of the things I'm proudest of living in Jamestown is the fact that we had people, not only Black, but white people as well as Silas Sherman, that worked the Underground Railroad and tried to help the runaways. You know, and, you know, Catherine Harris sacrificing her life, her freedom, for to help other people. You know, and that was a huge struggle for her and for the Black community. After that, it's really a struggle with poverty. And just like everyone else has talked about, where we talk about a lack of jobs that we have now in Jamestown, but for the Black community, there's always been a lack of jobs. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, a Black person couldn't get a job downtown. The only job you can get downtown was at, like, I think it was Bigelow's department store, and you could work at the elevator. you could hit the buttons. That was a job you could get downtown if you were black. And they had a few women that they would hire, and people thought, wow, that's such a great job. But they were there working the elevator. You couldn't get a job at MRC, which was at a time our #1 employer. And where you lived in the valley, in the numbered streets, it was called the Black Strip, for goodness sakes. But also, that's a business district. That's where the businesses that weren't able to be downtown because they weren't as glitzy and glamour, they were as glamorous. They weren't necessarily selling consumer goods as much as they were vehicles and other things. That's where you lived, so that's what you woke up to. It's a very impoverished area. And not only were black people there, but also poor white people were there. But it was known as the Black Strip because that was the place you could find black people in Jamestown. And what that's turned into now with the struggles is, I'd say it's a curse of low expectations. When I was a student, when I was a kid, I was a student at Ring Elementary School. And I was raised by my mom, who's white, and she made sure that my sister and me knew that we were black, that our father was black. And we went to the school, and at Ring, I was one of 5 black kids in my grade at Ring School. And then when I got to Washington, and you combined Ring School and Love School, then I was like, oh my goodness, there are other black people here. How cool is this? And that's when you learn that Love, even to this day, is the black school. But the stigma around that school is a huge problem because it's known as the low-performing school. It's known as the worst elementary school. No one wants to go to Love. Then when I went to Wash, after I got into the high school, I found out nobody wanted to go to Wash. Purcell and I still joke around with my friends that went to Purcell and Jefferson, and they say like, "Oh, you're in like the ghetto school, where you had a barbed wire fence around your school and there were shootings all the time." And I'm like, "You've never been to the north side of Jamestown, apparently." But that was the idea. That was the stigma around my school because we had a black population there. So it is very much, the struggles that the black community deals with. It's the same as anywhere else in the United States. And to go on top of that, for people that aren't from Jamestown, that are black, like my father, when he came here in '92, he always jokes with me, he couldn't find black people for months. He's just, I don't know where they are. Because where he was living, there wasn't that wasn't the black part of town, wasn't the black neighborhood, wasn't the numbered streets. So at times, the black population, out of necessity, has isolated themselves. Kind of like what you were saying earlier, where we all live in these silos. You have Puerto Rican neighborhoods in Jamestown, you have Hispanic neighborhoods, you have black neighborhoods, and that's still a big problem in Jamestown, is the fact that we are de facto segregated. We do live in these silos, and it's hard to break those silos, right? To this day, if you're a black person and you don't go to one of the 3 main churches, sometimes you don't feel as much a part of the community. And that's no blame to those churches, but if you are a religious or you're just not someone that goes to church all the time, or you go to a different church, you're at many times separated from your community. So there's just a lot of the same struggles that the rest of the United States has dealt with. We do in Jamestown as well.
I'm going to pause just for a brief station identification. You are listening to 107.9 WRFA in Jamestown.
Thank you for that. Well, I'm enthralled that, we have 5 questions that we thought we were going to get through. We are an hour and 5 minutes in to our 2 questions. So we're going to change the rules of the game a little bit because we're moderators and we can do that. So we're going to ask people to maybe be a little bit more concise, maybe a couple minutes. But this is
fire round?
The quick fire round. So we're still very much focused on the history of Jamestown, so we'll invite any of the panelists in no order. And if you don't have a story to share, that's fine, but we're looking for maybe a key moment that may have helped establish community or bring people to this area or really brought them into the limelight. So, for example, you talked about Maria being a moment where a lot of Puerto Ricans came over to the Jamestown area, right? So that's one example. Or a key moment that was really challenging or maybe altered the course of the communities that you are talking about today. So we're looking for a Jamestown-specific story that may have either brought folks here or highlighted the community or altered the course or challenged.
Well, I can go with a little advertisement to JVC. About 6-7 years ago, they knew there was a need for bilingual in different locations, especially in the medical field, because again, we're growing and keep growing. So they decided to start a 10-month program certificate as a cohort. So I was part of the group that brought 17 individual high school graduates that were not doing well. They were doing well, but not to the point they were educated in a way that they can advance their career. So they started with a 10-month program. Out of the 17, 16 graduate, which means before even they graduated, they already had jobs because there's a need. So if it's a need, and that's the thing we're missing in a lot of non-for-profit, there are needs to engage the Latino community, because they are, and they keep thinking about providing services. Treat us equally. So JVC did that to the point that those individuals went back and got an associate degree, then they got a bachelor degree, then we went to Dunkirk, which is another high population of Latino, and then now we're in Salamanca. So they see the needs of what the population is growing. They know that we can be educated. So they took a chance with us, and it's been, actually the Latino group broke every rule, every record that the college had in the past 100 years. Show up on time, did well in class, work hard, brought more Latinos. And the beautiful part that I think for me, because I became a professor there, that I see mom and daughter in the same class. Then I see son and dad in the same class. Because now they see, oh, if my son can do it, I can do it too. And it works the other way. If my mom is there, I'm going to go to college. So that is one of the biggest eye-opening that I see, that somebody took an opportunity and a chance to say, let's do this program, and it became successful. Instead of doing the opposite, they're stupid, sure, they don't speak English. And we did had students that the language was very low. And go back when I was in the military, my English from 1 to 10 was a 2. So the military took a chance on me, and I did 22 years in it because it was an opportunity. So think about the necessity that the city and the county need. And if you look around, and I'm not going to say anything, but they look around in the government, they hardly any Hispanic in it. They look around big corporation, and they do have Spanish at very in the low level, which is okay. You have to start in the low to grow up into the corporation, but have the opportunity to bring him in. So I think JVC, from my point of view, has done an amazing change of culture of our education to our community. And it's growing and still going. It's 7 years and still powerful moving forward. The opportunity is there. We take it and we grow.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on that question?
I can with that.
Sure.
So, really, where the Black community started growing is it was right before the Civil Rights Movement. Late 50s, early 60s. You actually had some families move to Jamestown from the South. As a prominent family, the Leeper family moved here from the South, and that created a much larger neighborhood. And right at that moment when the Civil Rights Movement really started, you had this interesting divide in the United States in the Black community, because you had, your more nonviolent resistance, Martin Luther King, and then you had your more separatist movement and self-defense movement with your Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, or Hajj Maluka el-Shabazz for my Muslim friends, is he came to Jamestown and spoke. And when he came to Jamestown and spoke, it was a really interesting moment for the Black community, because you had Black pastors writing the Post-Journal, trying to encourage the Black community to not go that separatist route. One, because they were worried about losing parishioners, because obviously this is the Nation of Islam. But two, it was, we want to start being, nonviolent. And it started a conversation of, well, we're not going that way. There wasn't ever a foothold in Jamestown from the Nation of Islam or a Black separatist movement. But it did get people to start talking about how can we fit into the civil rights movement. And those conversations eventually led to these home visits that people did, where members of the white community would go to the black community and have just dinner at their houses. And that led to the Human Rights Commission eventually, which we restarted just this year. So that right there was a huge moment, from just that migration from the South to really enrich the population, the black community, and then just those conversations about the civil rights movement. That's really a good point of emphasis that really energized the black community here.
Thank you.
And I'm glad Justin brought up the civil rights movement, because if you look at the history of the gay rights movement, a lot of people championing gay rights at one point, when they couldn't advance their own rights, often joined with African Americans on the premise, and some of the advisors to Martin Luther King were gay, on the premise that, well, it's not time for us to get our rights, but if we could only advance the rights of African Americans, then maybe we would have a shot at it too. And so I wasn't here at Jamestown at the time, and normally we date the modern gay rights movement from the Stonewall riots of 1969. And I had actually a participant here a few years ago. He's getting up there, but he talked at the college about what it was like that night. And so a lot of that was dated from that, and for some reason I always had the need to push out there. And so I ran for office, and at one point after 4 tries, so I'm pretty damn stubborn, I became the first openly gay city council president in the history of Jamestown. Stayed in that office somehow for 10 years. But every once in a while, when I was doing that stuff in the community, doing stuff at the college, I got tired, and I said, I just don't want to do this anymore. There's got to be somebody else who can stand up. And 2 things happened that kept me going. One time I was speaking at the Westfield Library, and this young girl stood up and she said, well, Mr. Rabb, you didn't know me. I was a student at JCC, but at the time I couldn't come out, and I never took your class, and I never went to any activity that you sponsored. But she said to me, every time I saw you walking down the hallway, I thought, okay, there's an openly gay man who's a professor, who's a city councilman. There's hope we can have a life. And she said, I just want to thank you. And at the other end of the spectrum, one day I was marching out of graduation, and this woman in her 70s who had no connection to JCC at all stopped me and said, Mr. Rabb. I said, yes. She said, well, you don't know me. I get a lot of that. I'm in my 70s, and my partner, a woman, recently died. And she said, we've lived in Jamestown all our lives, but we were afraid to be out like you were. But she said, every time I read about you in the newspaper, I felt good, because I thought, yeah, there is hope. And she said, can I give you a hug? And I said, sure, I love hugs. So she gave me a hug, and I remember marching back to take my robes off, and I thought, all right, this is why I do it. There's a lot of people out there that I'll never know who, for some reason or another, got some comfort and strength. And even now, as I'm getting older, I'm thinking, I got to stop this. And then I think, well, I can't. One, because it's who I am. That's what my nephew told me. He said, you can't stop. That's who you are. And I said, that's the smartest thing you ever said to me in 40 years. But then I keep thinking about other people, excuse my voice, who might take comfort from my, what I call rabble-rousing. So I guess I'm still going to keep rabble-rousing.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Stonewall, and Stonewall was started by a black trans woman, and I think that should tell us that even though we're talking about separate communities, really these communities aren't separate at all. There are black LGBTQ people, there are Afro-Latina, and there are Hispanic LGBTQ, there are Afro-Latino people, and people that deal with substance abuse are, or substance use, are of all these different communities. So really what we got to talk about is the intersectionality, and like what you talked about earlier, where really bringing all these groups together and having the conversation, not necessarily of how can my community prosper, but how can we as a community prosper.
And
that
I'm
was
glad you said that, because Stonewall was led by trans women of color,
Yes.
not nice little white boys. It was trans women of color who had enough and scared the hell out of the police, because here are these trans women of color in high heels and pearls fighting back, and they could not believe the intensity. So God bless trans women of color who stood up for me in 1969 when I couldn't do it.
Like I was saying, is if we unite, it's powerful.
Yeah.
And we're not, and hopefully the conversation we're having here continues. And we have a very bad disease in Jamestown that will start a really beautiful thing, and within 2 months, it goes away. So I don't know who need to be pushing this. Greg, that's your job, to keep pushing the conversation, because this is powerful. This is enrichment. This is really, like I said before, a catalyst to something good. Please don't stop.
And one of our hopes, and maybe I'm previewing or giving people reason to come back into the following week's conversations, is we're really going to try and tackle that question of how do these communities work together, how do we support one another across boundaries. So I am going to keep us moving in the interest of time. Invite you, but don't feel compelled that you have to share.
Stephen?
On our previous question or going forward? At the previous question?
Yes.
Yeah, one of the things, those historical touch points in my community aren't there, at least connected with people, as I hear a lot of us talking about people. But I think recently one of the things our community has really experienced is the opioid problem, the overdose crisis. And what's interesting about that was one of the things that really started that in our community was a law in New York State called I-Stop. And we all thought this was a wonderful thing. And in many ways it is. It was a central registry that required all doctors, when they were prescribing any type of opioid, to check to make sure that a patient isn't getting opioids from another provider. So previous to that point, you could doctor shop. So I could go to a doctor in Jamestown and get a prescription for opioids, and he'd have no way of knowing that I was also getting a prescription from a doctor in Westfield and a doctor in Fredonia. The only way it would come up was that your insurance wouldn't pay for each one, but you could pay for it out of pocket, use those substances, often sell them on the street, and cover your cost. And so when this New York State law came into effect, all of us who are working in the recovery field thought this is going to be great because it's going to stop that abuse of that, and it did. But the thing that we didn't plan properly for was how are we going to treat and support all these folks who can no longer go to 5 different doctors in Jamestown or Chautauqua County and get these medications. So we didn't, as a recovery community, we didn't think that through, and we weren't ready for it. So what it did was it pushed everyone who had problems with opioids to buying them from the streets. And in one sense, there's a benefit if you're abusing an opioid to abuse a pharmaceutical pill because you know what's in it. And you're not going to die from it, and you're going to know the potency. But if you're buying something on the street, you don't know what's in it. You don't know the potency, and there is the option of making the potency even stronger by adding, which then came down the pipe, synthetic opioids, fentanyl, as we all know it now. So thinking of that, those moments that really had a great impact here in Jamestown recently, I think of those two things together because it seemed really good, and there have been benefits from it, but one of the results has been tragic. So, yeah.
I did ask Jason Sample, our person who gave our introduction, if we had any audience questions, and there was one that came up that said, of all the panelists talking tonight are part of communities where some of the local history has been lost. irretrievably in many cases. And what actions would the panelists like to see local history organizations make to preserve the history that is still available now and moving forward? So I think we'll start with an easy person. I think we'll start, Greg, because you mentioned this already, that the Fenton History Center has done some preservation of the LGBTQ plus local history. Is there anything else that you would like to see them or other groups do going forward?
Well, the other thing that happened, and Steve was very much a part of it, I think, was it 2 years ago, Steve, that at the Jackson Center, with
Right.
their cooperation, fortunately, you guys, it was a weekend when I couldn't be there, but you were recording, I think, people's coming out stories.
Right.
So
right.
that
and
we
that
added
was
to the history.
Yeah, our first Pride Festival got delayed
Right.
because of COVID, so we were able to be pretty nimble and come up with an event on National Coming Out Day where I really had it was just such a wonderful day to interview people in our community as to about their coming out story, what that was like, what they experienced, what was the impact of that. And that was all recorded, all of those stories, and those are in the archive of the Fenton History Museum now. You know, for our community, the queer community, where we don't have stuff like this, it's very exciting to know that we have that now. So we've made some progress with that.
And I should have mentioned also that Julia was part of that. So
Yes,
Yes.
she was.
I didn't mean to overlook you, Julia.
That's perfectly fine. So,
We appreciate what you all did.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes. Moving to your right, Justin, if there was something, we do have some local history, I think,
Yeah.
that's taught in schools about the African community, but is there something else that you haven't seen that you would like local organizations to work
I mean,
on?
we have some of our local history taught in our local schools. So the problem with just history in local schools is because of New York State curriculum, and I know this because I'm a social studies teacher, local history really ends in 4th grade. When you get into middle school, 5th, 6th, you're doing global studies, which, you know, is the entire history of the world in 2 years. You can do that, right? And then in 7th and 8th grade, you're to U.S. history. 9th, 10th, you're back to global studies. 11th, U.S. 12, that's when you are taught civics, so you can vote. You know, we do the whole civics thing 1 year. You know, I'm not bitter or anything like that. But so it is very difficult to teach local history in New York State. Like I said, I didn't learn about Catherine Harris and the black community in Jamestown until I went to SUNY Fredonia and I took a class on local history. So what I would like to see, because the things are there, I did my research in Mayville, and I also did it at the Fenton at the time, 10 years ago when I did this research. What I'd like to see is more of a celebration of it. Over the summer, when the Underground Railroad statues at Dow Park were, one was stolen, the other two were vandalized with white supremacist symbols. For some people, that was the time they learned that we had a history of the Underground Railroad in Jamestown. And it's a shame that it took actual Nazis for us to start to learn our own local history. So I'd like to see more of a celebration of that. And if we can integrate it into schools, that would be fantastic. It does fit into U.S. history, obviously. So that would take a little bit of flexibility from the teachers to go outside of those textbooks and use other sources, and local sources. And why we need to do that, it isn't just for the black community. History of black people, women, of LGBTQ people, of Latina people, a lot of times when you are learning history, that's left for the end of the chapter. So it's the real U.S. history, and then the last chapter is like, let's put then all the women, black people, Latin people, Native American, in the last chapter, put them in there. And what we need is an integration of that throughout all of U.S. history, because we are part of the United States, even though we are not from the white community. And in Jamestown, a lot of what we celebrate is Lucy, which is fantastic. I'm 31, so I'm not a big Lucy fan.
but
What are you trying to say?
yeah, but I love all of the paintings around town. I love that there are stores dedicated to just Lucy. But then I think, I mean, Lucy was great. She was a pioneer for women and for entertainment. And we also had a pioneer for women in Jamestown with Catherine Harris, who is very rare to find a female black Underground Railroad conductor that saved the lives of at least 20 people. Why are we not celebrating her? Why are we not promoting that on a much larger scale, beyond just the statues in Dow Park, beyond just one thing, and really spread that out so that it benefits not only the black community, but the entire community of Jamestown, so they can see that this isn't a history of the other group, this is a history of America. If you're white and you're from Jamestown, Catherine Harris is part of your history as well. So I think that's what I'd like to see is, it's there, let's start to celebrate it.
Max, you mentioned that within your community, and we've heard this echo too, is that it's an oral history in Hispanic and Latino community. And so if you're looking at your community's history, are you hearing similar things that you would agree that, yes, we would like to see something like this, in terms of archiving the Hispanic community's history, or do you have other thoughts on how that could be incorporated locally?
The old Hispanic, they've been here for many years, are dying off. We need to record them, just like they didn't find out why they came here, some of the history behind that part of it. But also the city had to integrate the history within. We have plenty bridges that we can put the Puerto Rican flag. This is a month of Hispanic Heritage Month. Lucy is married to a Cuban guy. So you see his picture, but nobody knows his background. He's Lucy's husband, which makes, and if you look at his history on TV, he changed the whole dynamic, how to do TV, live TV, and nobody knows about that. So yeah, just the city also has to get involved. The school definitely, I think, is going to get involved because they hire some Hispanic navigator, and part of this, like you said, is teaching Puerto Rico history. And this is what is sad for me. Majority of the Puerto Rican here have no clue about Puerto Rican history. No clue. So they don't have a background on it. So I do understand, because I love history and I study history. So they don't even know their history. The only thing they know is the flag. So we need to do, just like he said, is we need to do more educational from the school point of view, but also for the city point of view. Are the cities going to celebrate black history? Are they going to say Hispanic history? Or we're going to say, oh no, and that happened in the past. We can't do this because if I do this for you, then I have to do it for everybody else. Good. Do it for everybody else. And that's part of the learning from each other. And I'm not doing it because I just want to be unique. I'm doing it because I'm part of the community. Do it. You have 2 bridges, you can put 20 flags, Hispanic flag, in 2 bridges, and I'm telling you, it look beautiful. And if it's African American, then you put the faces in posters in the light poles. People can say, who's that? And the thing about us, about learning, is when you see some new faces, say, who is that? And you search for that person. Or maybe the school can get it. So part of us is to integrate, not because I want you to celebrate Hispanic culture. Well, we are here, why not? Celebrate all the culture. So don't make excuses, we're gonna do it for this, we have to do it for everybody else. Good, let's move it. And hopefully this conversation, we get the city and the county moving to that direction.
Steve, you've mentioned that there's been more documentation of, at least when we saw AA come to Jamestown, Narcotics Anonymous, and different organizations. Are you, in terms of maybe individual stories and experiences, is there anything you think that would be helpful in terms of gathering that history of that community, or is it something that you think that people want to have out there too?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for me in the community that I'm here to represent. I think I'm a person in recovery. And initially there was resistance on my part to tell my story in a public way, although when you're hired into a position to lead an organization like mine, that's part of the job description. And before I got to that point, I had embraced it. So one of the things at the MHA that we've started doing is doing, in an informal way, videotaping some of our participants telling their stories, telling their story of recovery. And we've done that in partnership with the county and the Department of Mental Hygiene. The Department of Mental Hygiene has really done some great work with us in filming and interviewing people. There's a whole bunch of footage that it's not quite edited yet and released, but I'm really excited for it. So it's when we're able to do that, I think it reinforces the idea that recovery is possible, that as a person in recovery, I can rejoin a community and be an active and vibrant part of a community. And it also tells other people in the community that recovery is possible. You know, when I stand up in front of people and introduce myself, I always mention that I'm a person in recovery, because when I do that, and when people realize that at one point I was a homeless IV drug user, and now I'm able to lead an organization in Chautauqua County, that recovery is possible. And so for those of us who are willing to do that, video is a real powerful tool to help us do that. So we've started doing that, and we have to decide where we're going to keep that now for the long term. But I think that's one way that really helps the community that I serve.
Where did I think I've seen some of these posts on your Facebook page? Where can, if people want to see these stories, is there a place they can go now?
Yeah, our Facebook page, which is at MHA Chautauqua on Facebook, that's a great place to look and look through there. Some of this is on our website, which is mhachautauqua.org. There will be more coming to our website too. So as that's released in partnership with Chautauqua County Department of Mental Hygiene. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this would be a good time to remind our audience members, both present in the studio here today and watching online, that we welcome your questions. So if you'd like to do this in-house, feel free to raise your hand, although we have a lot of bright lights coming at us, so we can't see you, but hopefully our staff members there can. And the same invitation for those folks who are online. While we're waiting for that, I think maybe an open invitation for any of our panelists to share. Is there a part of your community's history that we haven't covered that you think would be really important to highlight briefly? Because we are running short on time. We've got about 27 minutes left. So I'll ask that as a very broad, open question. Anything that you think that would be important for our audience members to know about that we haven't covered?
Greg?
Max is looking at me right away.
And it's okay if you don't. We can.
Well, I would suggest one of the things that's happening is, and I have trouble keeping up with it, there's an explosion of identities called sexual orientation, gender identity. And the terminology and the way people are coming to terms and describing themselves, even though I teach this stuff, I can't keep up with it. And, you know, it was hard enough dealing with asexual, pansexual, intersex, but now there's people with different labels, and I'm always, and so it's sort of a living history. This is changing around us really fast. And people always say to me, well, where were these people all this time? I said, well, we were always here. We just didn't know even how to describe ourselves. So you know, again, with me being able to have the luxury of teaching this stuff and researching it, I can't keep up with all the different ways. And for me, that's pretty exciting that people are so comfortable saying, you know, this is who I am. And then, you know, the other thing that people often ask me about the pronoun situation, and International Pronoun Day is coming up on the 20th. So if you look at my email, it says preferred pronouns, he, his, him. And I got more people at the college doing that. And people say, why do you do that? I said, well, you don't want to be misgendered. You know, and people say, well, how do I know what to do? I said, well, if you don't know, just ask. Most people are saying, this is who I am. So I think we're this really dynamic living history that those of us even in the field are just struggling to keep up with the whole thing. But that's good. That's exciting. I love the fact it's like being on a roller coaster, even though I don't like roller coasters. But.
One of my, because at the school I work at in Salamanca, I advise a group of student activists. They're very proactive about LGBTQ rights. And one of them was talking to me the other day, and they said demi-pronouns, and and they just kept going, and I was like, wait, because I don't know what that means. And they explained that to me, and I don't know if I can explain it in a coherent way. So, but it's fantastic that this younger generation, Gen Z, is, like you said, so open about gender acceptance and gender fluidity and sexual fluidity, and it's very different even from me when I was in high school. So it is really interesting to learn from my students that are high school students, and some of them are 12 and know more about that than I do, and I try to keep up to date. So yeah, it is interesting.
What I see is a small business, Latino business, coming up. At least 4 Mexican restaurants around here. La Rumba he took an opportunity and a chance a year ago on the COVID to start his business, and he's moving forward. I think that in general is open. The door is now open, but there's a little crack in the window. So in general, that's good for us. Education is becoming really good. One of the things that make me cry, and I do cry once in a while, was then when I was at the East Side and I asked them, my middle school kid, what do you want to do? Do what my mom is doing. What is that? Welfare. So they didn't have a vision of what the future was, or is, or could be. And now I see that changes. So either the school district's doing some movement, the college is definitely doing some movement, because they see their cousin, their uncle, their brothers, their nephew going to college, was not part. And by the way, some of them were the first one to go to college. So that movement is moving, business is moving. I'm sad that the Havana Cafe is closed because of COVID, but it's coming back. So the movement is there, little by little, but it's going to happen.
I think one of the things I would love people to know about our community is one of the things that as a recovery community we're embracing is this concept of harm reduction. And I think a lot of people don't know what that is. And traditionally, the recovery community has been based on an abstinence model where you make a commitment to stop using any substances chaotically, and then you stop. And while for some people that's achievable like that, we've come to realize as a community that that's probably not a realistic way in which most people are able to reach a healthy place in their life. So like 12-step recovery is based on a complete abstinence model. So to introduce these concepts of harm reduction, where we're actually celebrating and supporting small steps forward, small healthy steps forward. So if somebody perhaps is using a substance like perhaps they're buying heroin off the street and they're also buying cannabis off the street, if we can work to cut down on the amount of heroin that they're buying and using off the street to maybe 2 times a week, and they're smoking marijuana or cannabis maybe 5 times a week, that we celebrate that victory as a path forward, as a positive step forward, as opposed to holding out that goal of complete and total abstinence. And what that does is it meets people where they're at. It brings respect to the relationship that we have in trying to support people. It really is a path forward in which a lot of people in our community are embracing and finding success. We have a needle exchange program here in Jamestown. That is a harm reduction technique. And I tip my hat to our county leaders who allowed and signed off on that being here in Chautauqua County. Most rural counties in the Northeast do not have needle exchange programs. So for our county to sign off on that and embrace that, that's a huge step forward. So things like that we don't always hear about that I think are really exciting that's happening in our county right now.
And I just want to let you know we are sharing a document. I cannot get into it. So technology has failed me.
And I'm trying to subtly send you some messages here. All right, so we're just going to take moderator's privilege here a little bit. So our original goal was to highlight the issue of generational poverty as well. And as we noted earlier, our panelist was not able to be here, but poverty intersects with race, intersects with substance use, intersects with LGBTQ populations. I want to be cautious that you may not have a lot of research or expertise, but if you have some thoughts to offer to so that we're keeping that in the scope of our focus here, how does the intersection of race and poverty and sexuality and poverty and substance use kind of come together? If you have some thoughts to share there, that
we have to define what poverty is.
Okay.
I don't think we have poverty. We have socioeconomics situation. Because if you go to quote unquote people that supposed to be in poverty, large TV, everybody has a cell phone, everybody has sneakers, brand new sneakers. So how would you define poverty? And I have the trouble for many years when people say, this had a lot of poverty in Jamestown. If you haven't traveled the world, we're pretty rich. Even the poor people here have pretty much a lot. So we have to be careful that, and from my point of view, we don't have Latinos that are poor. We have Latinos that are, maybe they don't understand the financial way of managing the money. They got plenty of money coming in, how to spend it. So we need to start teaching that part. Soft skill is very important. So you can have a person that you give him $3,000 or $4,000 a month, and at the end of the week, they're broke. They're getting $4,000 a month. That's a lot of money. You call him poverty, in poverty? So how we're going to define poverty is important. So are they social economics? Yeah, because they don't know how to manage their money.
So in my head, I think there's money management, but then I'm also really thinking about folks who are constantly living under the fear of housing insecurity, food insecurity, not having access to reliable and good health care, right? Like there are absolutely populations in every part of the USA, and I'm sure in Jamestown as well, that people who are really struggling to make ends meet. So that's where my focus was, but
Yeah.
I will encourage panelists to take it wherever they want to.
So when I think of poverty, and what I would say I vary from you is, I don't think of income, I think of wealth. And so when it comes to income, this is the money that I'm regularly getting in. When it comes to wealth, this is the income, but all of the property and all of the things that I have that have accumulated over generations, as well as, throughout my time being not only working, but just being alive. So I can tell you, I've lived in Jamestown my entire life. I was born in 1990, and we do have generational poverty here. And a lot of it is because the same populations of people have not been able to purchase homes. That is a big problem here. And that is the easiest way to start generating wealth, is to own real estate. And for some communities here, it has been more difficult to do that. Now, for the black community specifically, that's because you had de facto segregation. You have it now, but it also because you had redlining. And it was also because, like I said earlier, you did not have access to the higher paying careers. Also, when you are someone that lives in poverty, it's not just about money or resources. It's about environment as well. For the impoverished community in Jamestown, especially the black community, you are living in a business district. So you're living next to car dealerships. You're living next to large grocery stores or gas stations. That is a different environment and a different experience altogether than someone that's living on Lakeview, or that's someone that lives next to Allen Park. So they are different experiences. And like you said earlier, when you talked about the student that you had that wanted to do what their mother did, which was live on welfare, when you only see that outcome, it's very hard to have a goal of something that you can't even imagine. For the black community, we're in that exact same space. If you wanted to become a police officer in Jamestown and you're black, you have really one example that I grew up with. She was our school resource officer, was the only black cop that we saw. And it blew not only my mind as a black person, but it blew some of the female students' minds, just the kids in the high school, because like, wow, there's a black cop in high school. How cool is this? Maybe everybody could be a cop. Maybe black people could be cops in Jamestown Public Schools or Jamestown Police Department. But then in Jamestown Public Schools, we did not have any black teachers. All of our teachers were white, and maybe one or two Latino, Latina teachers. So I would say that that's one of the more difficult things when you're talking about generational poverty in Jamestown, is the fact that, you know, it is very difficult when everything about your life has been in that sense of poverty, and it's hard to achieve something that you have not seen.
But at the stigma of calling Latino poor, they don't like that.
Well, I don't.
And that's
believe,
that's what I mean. That's what I mean. It's not
Yeah.
the definition when you talk into a community or population of people. Say you're a bunch of poor people. That come out very negative. So I'm with you.
Yeah.
Property, make your wealth. But then again, if you don't know how to manage your property, what happened?
Right, but you learn how to manage your
So
property
that's what I'm saying,
from
education-
your parents, because
education
they were there to
start-
manage their
right.
property, and they learned from their parents, and that's where that generational wealth
And
comes
that
in.
starts in the school district, teaching basic and fundamental finance.
I'll invite either Greg or Steve if you want to reflect on that question of the intersection of poverty and.
Yeah, one of the things that we're really aware of now in treating people who have substance use disorder is looking at those social determinants of health and those things that, and how poverty impacts people, how domestic violence impacts people, and that repeated pattern of, especially with a lot of the people who we work with at the MHA, that pattern of domestic violence is huge, and it's hard to break that cycle. It's really hard, and with poverty too. You know, one of the things that's I found interesting. I've worked in the recovery field in Jamestown, and I've worked in the recovery field in New York City, and in one sense, it's not fair to compare them because they're apples and oranges, but they're at different ends of New York State too. But it's for somebody who emerges to a place of stability, who's in recovery, the opportunities to immediately transition into whether it's a job or a position where you could benefit from economic growth are so much different in a big community than a small community. And the benefits that many people have in a small community like Jamestown, they don't have in Jamestown. That really sense of intimate community can be really supportive for somebody who's in recovery. But then it can work against you too, especially if you've established a negative pattern of behavior in your life because of a substance use issue. So, and poverty, what I call poverty, really impacts a lot of the people who we work with. So, and I love what Max is saying about teaching how to manage your money. That's one of the things that we've realized is just an essential part. If we show somebody in recovery how to manage your feelings, how to deal with anger, how to take your medication properly, and if that's all we're showing them, we're not preparing them for sustained recovery. We need to show them, how do you manage your money? How do you talk to your employer when you have a disagreement with your employer? How do you reach out into the community for other supports and resources when you don't have that really wonderful, incredible, almost cocoon that comes from being in treatment? So we realize now that those are the things we also need to teach, and the way we support people in recovery at the MHA has changed, and it's also changing in the clinics in our community too, and that's a good thing. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Yeah, the only thing I would add is that there's a stereotype that those of us who are gay are all well off, and that we're all in coupled relationships with no children, so you have two earners and you can indulge yourself. And that's true for some of us. But if you look at the stats, more than 50% of LGBTQ people live alone. And a lot of the poverty that happens in the queer community is very similar to what happens in the rest of society. It's women, lesbians, who are living alone, often raising children from relationships that ended, especially my generation, because when I was growing up, there's a great deal of pressure to hide who you were. I know, because I almost got married to a woman. There were no other options. But so there, and then if you look at trans folks who have no legal protection in most of the states in this country, you know, we're very lucky in New York that we've got a lot of protection. But as I often say to my students, you know, if I go to Warren, like right after this, my rights as a gay man disappear. And so you can be discriminated against, and you can lose your job. And this is typically falling on women, typically falling on women of color, typically falling on trans women, and who have a very high level of suicide. And so a lot of folks then turn to sex work, which, you know, you can sort of make a living, but it's also extremely dangerous. And so and a lot of the poverty in the LGBTQ community is hidden because we basically don't collect statistics on it. So we don't know what we don't know because, you know, most people still don't necessarily admit it to a census taker. And that's changing, but, you know, there's a significant amount of poverty, a lack of income, lack of jobs in the LGBTQ community.
So I think we're about to wrap it up, but we did have something that was passed along to us. If you're enjoying these conversations, we will have 2 other weeks of this, but there is also another community conversation that is taking place on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the conversation is entitled Becoming the Beloved Community. And this will take place at Zion Covenant Church in Jamestown on Saturday, October 2nd from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. So that will be split into 2 sections with a lunch break in between. Session 1 will focus on cultural competency, and that begins at 9 a.m. And session 2 will focus on racial reconciliation, and that will run from 1 to 2 p.m. The featured speaker will be Reverend Paul Robinson, who is the executive minister of the Love, Mercy, Do Justice mission priority of the Evangelical Covenant Church. So there's no cost to attend this workshop, but there is a $10 donation request if you want to attend the luncheon. So if you're looking for more information on this or to RSVP, you can visit zioncovenant.org. So I just would like to thank all our panelists for being here tonight to share your stories and experience with us. And, you know, if I can ask the audience to give them a round of applause for our very first. So we will be having our second round of conversations next week, Thursday, September 30th at 6 p.m. We'll be continuing the conversation to look at the current state of these communities in Jamestown, and then also on October 7th, we will conclude the series with a look toward the future and action steps that we may be able to take. So thank you once again to Justin, Greg, Max, Steve, also Amit for joining us here as my co-moderator. If you would like to view this presentation again, we will have this available on our social media, on Facebook, WRFA LP, and on YouTube as well, WRFA LP. You can search there to find, and we hope to also possibly be airing this again on our airways, 107.9 FM. So on behalf of Amit, Jason Sample, and the entire WRFA team, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you next week.